Today marks 8 years in the civil war in Syria, and all week we've taken a closer look at different issues that have shaped the conflict and added to the death and destruction. Here's what we know. Since 2011, almost 368,000 people have died. Another 192,000 people are either missing or presumed dead. As of December 2018, almost 40% of deaths are directly related to the fighting. The conflict has also created what many call the worst refugee crisis in the world. At least 6.2 million Syrians are internally displaced, while another 5.7 have sought refuge abroad. And overall, 13 million people are believed to be in dire need of humanitarian aid there. The country's also suffered at the hands of terror. At its height, the Islamic State's so-called caliphate spanned over a third of both Iraq and Syria. And though the group's presence is down to a small piece of territory, military officials say ISIS remains a threat. Well, the Syrian people have also been victim to chemical warfare. A study released last month estimates that more than 300 chemical attacks have been launched during the course of the war. And the report says 98% of those attacks were actually carried out by the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Well, there are still many questions that remain unanswered. When can people return to their homes? When will the fighting actually stop? Well, after 8 years, the end doesn't seem to be in arm's reach. Diana Darke joins me now from London. She's a Middle East culture expert specializing in Syria. She's also written several books on Syria, including The Last Sanctuary in Aleppo. Diana, you've been back and forth to Syria several times since the conflict started in 2011. You even have a house there. From your perspective, how has the country changed since the start of the war?
It's beyond describing, actually. And just listening to your report now, I'm struck by the fact that Syria, for people perhaps as far away as in America, has been reduced to a series of statistics. But these statistics are sort of meaningless until you put them into perspective. And you realize that when you talk about some of these numbers, that half the Syrian population is displaced either internally or externally. 80% of the population is now below the poverty line. I mean, these are statistics that it's very hard to grasp. When you're just talking millions this, thousands that, it's very difficult to really grasp that until you understand. I mean, imagine having half the American population displaced. It's just defies credibility. And we've watched it happen.
Absolutely, and even more heartbreaking knowing that they could be in limbo for decades to come, trying to find a home of their own. I want to ask you, you were traveling to Syria the day that the U.S., Britain, and France launched military attacks on Syria after a chemical attack was carried out by the Assad regime. Tell me what your purpose was heading to Syria, and what did you see?
Well, that was pure fluke that it just happened to be that day. Obviously, that was completely by chance. I was actually going in as part of a church group. I mean, it was the only way to get in at that time under a group faith visa. But I can tell you that whilst the world was busy focusing on the legality of this strike, nobody in Syria, actually, ordinary Syrians really didn't care who was responsible for what. I mean, the whole legality of it was an irrelevance for people on the ground. I mean, they are just desperately looking for some way out of this war in which, 2/3 of the countries of the world have been involved in the Syrian conflict now in some shape or form. It's become an internationalized civil war. And of course, ISIS, as your report correctly said, has sort of hijacked it so that in the West, all our attention was focused on ISIS, and we lost sight of what was happening in the rest of the country. So Idlib was also mentioned. Well, Idlib has now been taken over by the Al-Qaeda affiliated group Jabhat al-Nusra, and nobody's even paid any attention to that. Everybody's still busy focusing on this final pocket of ISIS because President Trump seems to only be aware of that and wants to pull out as quickly as he can. And his decision, his very sudden decision to announce the American withdrawal, has set in chain a series of events which has led to the Al-Qaeda affiliate taking over Idlib province. I mean, nobody talks about that.
Diana, do you think Syrian President Bashar al-Assad will ever be held accountable?
Maybe decades hence, yeah. I mean, people are trying very hard to bring cases against him. I mean, the evidence is mounting. I mean, although he himself, of course, constantly denies it. And of course, he blames America for all the ills of the country at the moment. I mean, in Syria at the moment, they've only got, even in the capital of Damascus, there are only about 2 hours of electricity every day, chronic gas shortages. I mean, the infrastructure is shot to pieces. And of course, Assad is blaming the American sanctions and the Western sanctions. Very, very convenient for him. So he's deflecting all blame for this and puts it all down to a foreign conspiracy. And everybody who's fighting him is a terrorist. That's the language he has spoken right from day one. Mm-hmm. You've got to give him 10 out of 10 for consistency.
Diana Darke, I want to thank you very much for your time and for joining us.